Hello, my name is Jason Nelson. I'm the founder and principal consultant at Necessary Security. I started this company to help other companies start, build, and mature their threat modeling and cloud security practice. My experience in the industry has allowed me to work with almost all the major consultancies and had come to the realization that there was not really a prescriptive and adaptable approach to working with customers on threat modeling because there are not enough people that understand what threat modeling can be at scale because there's very few large programs. We'll get into more details on things like that in another discussion, another topic. Today will be the first podcast for Necessary Security YouTube channel. And the focus of the channel is basically going to be discuss threat modeling, cloud security, and other relevant topics within the industry. For today, our initial speaker, and I'm very happy that Bryce is able to join us to be the first speaker because I've worked with him for a while and I really appreciate his work, and he'll be an excellent resource for people to learn from. So Bryce, how'd you like to introduce yourself?
Great, thanks, Jason, and glad to be with you and honored to be your first guest on this podcast. So my name, as Jason mentions, Bryce Johnson. The past approximately 10 years, I've worked in various information security roles for large financial institutions, and where those roles were things such as data loss prevention engineer, SOC analyst, and then most recently, where I was a threat modeler, mainly focused on cloud architectures.
Nice. So for everybody here or everybody that's going to watch this, the topic that we're going to talk about today is basically how, we all have had jobs in technology, and then some of us transition to be threat modelers or get assigned a role to do threat modeling and our job. And so the topic today is kind of about what the perspective changes when that transition occurs. So as you were just saying, you've had different roles prior to doing threat modeling and prior to focusing just on program and process for threat modeling. Like, what are some of the differences between being a threat modeler from your perspective and some of the roles you've had in the past?
Yeah, so for me, as I mentioned, I worked as a data loss prevention engineer, and what that really entailed was crafting and creating specific policies that would look for data exfiltration. So we were specifically looking into protecting the data of the financial institution I worked for. So things like PII, so credit card numbers, social security numbers that could be exfiltrated outside the bank, whether that was via email, web uploads. So those types of policies we would create and basically use to protect the organization I worked for.
So as you were saying, you had other roles and you then transitioned into being a threat modeler. So maybe just if you could just kind of share what are some of the differences of being a threat modeler and some of the other roles that you've had in the past.
Yeah, so using like the example of the data loss prevention engineer, we were focused on you know creating policies to detect when PII or sensitive information was exfiltrated from the organization I worked at. So it was very limited focus, and it was kind of once we established that attack vector existed, what's our one way of handling that, and trying to mitigate the threat there. And similarly with the SOC analyst, we were just focused on our silo where, we understood that there was a signal that happened, and then we were receiving that signal and providing some type of response, in some cases, remediation efforts related to the understanding that this event already occurred. Whereas threat modeling, it's much more of a broader perspective. So we're considering, and ideally we're looking into, before this happened. So how can we understand the architecture we're looking at, and then provide mitigations of various ways to lower the risk of those threats occurring.
Right. So the way I'm understanding that is, again, like your role was more focused on achieving DLP types of controls. Threat modeling is going to look broader. What's an example of maybe so people can really wrap their head around that? Because the concept seems conceptually pretty easy. Like, hey, you're focused on one thing, and threat modeling, you're looking at a lot more stuff. What's maybe an example of something of a threat or an attack that, as a threat modeler, you would create versus your old role?
Yeah, so the best example I can think of is where, and again, because my previous experience at the bank, there would be applications that would handle, credit card numbers. So using the example of a threat modeler, I could be looking at that and threat modeling that application and identifying this application and what are the ways we're going to secure the whole application. So, who has access to the credit card numbers? Should they have access to it? So, one of the threat or one of the controls we could implement would be create a list of authorized identities to have access to that data. Um, Create a process around, you know, uh, removing that data or masking that data, so that you only have access to the necessary information needed. And then networking controls around, where that data can be transferred to, so data in motion, such that, before it even gets to the stage of the individual handling the data and possibly moving the data, we have those controls in place to mitigate the threat.
No, I like that a lot. And just as a mental note for me, I want to come back to Signal because I think that is something that's really great, especially from a threat modeling to SOC, like control engineering into SOC. I think that's a really interesting point that maybe people who are not working at large organizations or more mature programs, it's not a topic they get discussed. So maybe we'll get back to that a little bit later, but I just want to make the note that we come back to it. But I mean, continuing on this, transition theme, because that's kind of what we're talking about today. Uh, how has your perspective changed after becoming a threat modeler? Because you've had all these experiences before, and you get security, and you really understand these systems. So what's the difference? Because now since you've lived on both sides, how do you tell someone that hasn't come over to threat modeling what the actual difference is?
Yeah, I think, and especially looking at like a well-defined threat modeling process, it really needs to be done as early in the process as possible. So really a successful program should be done in the design phase where I touched on this earlier, but where you're able to kind of like give direction to the engineers who are designing the application or service that is being threat modeled, how to design this in a secure way, such that you have a smaller attack surface and ultimately that benefits the other uh, security professionals and broadly the organization as a whole. So the more the secure design, the smaller the vector is for threats. And really the lower the work effort is downstream too, because you'll have less events, you'll have um, you know, smaller updates for the developers if they, design it in a more secure way, as opposed to identifying the threats later in the process where the business and the developers are closer to production. So I think that was kind of the one big takeaway for me, was that really threat modeling can be used to enhance the overall security of the organization and really drive down the threats and overall risk of the organization experiencing those threats.
Yeah, well, because I've had the benefit of working with you and seeing your transition. Let me ask a more specific question around this. When you transitioned to be a threat modeler and you were introduced to the threat modeling process, and there were things like mapping to external frameworks. There were uh, communicating to other teams who may not agree with you about what the threat is. Is the threat even real? And so getting to a successful pattern of, identifying threats, getting threats worked on and mitigated through control creation, and integration into SOC and things like that. I mean, things like MITRE, how the language you wrote the threats in that then engineering or somebody down the line had to interpret. Like, talk to me some about those transitions and learnings.
Yeah, no, I think that's a key piece, right? So, I know you mentioned MITRE, but MITRE or even a CVE, but like mapping to things like a global framework like MITRE provides, uh, it demonstrates the effectiveness of those threats, right? So we can provide um, behaviors that the attackers would take based on the MITRE framework. It references that these are behaviors that attackers take and provides examples of, when those threats were successfully performed by attackers.
And so with that, I mean, you then have to communicate. So I remember having gone through this a couple times, mapping to the external references and frameworks kind of gives a little weight, a little reality. So this isn't theoretical. This actually happens. Somebody that is a trusted external organization, is reporting this is real and how to mitigate it. So that's useful in solving the why do I need to do this problem. But let's talk about the communication part of it. I mean, how much did you struggle entering into a program where you had to communicate using um, a structured language like Gherkin or something, or even just in plain English to
Yeah,
someone that had to build a control? Like what was the struggle there? What was that learning curve for you?
yeah, no, it was it really like drove home the point of, what's a good approach into explaining threats and controls. So, part of my experience was in writing it in, a specific language like English, and the differences in the understanding of a threat and a control at first was quite painful. So we moved to the control specification language of Gherkin, where we defined specific, and I'll give an example where it was like a specific service, a specific action or behavior, and then a specific result. So given a service and an action takes place, when some occurrence happens, then we would describe, what the outcome is of that. In my example, the threat. So we could demonstrate that this is the behavior the attacker not just can take, but does take, and reference back to that MITRE tactic and technique and procedure. And we found great success in that, because we were able to demonstrate not only does that what the attacker does perform in the wild, but also a lot of like understanding between the teams that we have this common way that we're describing, not just to the engineer, but also to our partners who are implementing the controls as well. And it really enabled them to streamline their implementation process as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and then the way to describe it. I think for me, in my transition from doing other roles into building, performing threat modeling and building programs, is I think people in regular technology roles think about the way the system was designed and focus on that. Like, they may even have security in mind,
Mhm.
but they're only thinking about it in the context of, well, the system's supposed to do this. And then they think about how that could be broken or where the security needs to be enabled for that. Threat modeling, because of the way you just described, putting these things in externally referenceable frameworks, describing it in a structured language, you really change your perspective from the way this system was intended to work, the way the developer was told to build a system, versus all these actions are possible. And so any number of RBAC, IAM, encryption, network, other domains could affect these actions being enacted, whether they were intended by the developer or not. They're technically possible. And so that's the big perspective change I had. And I continue to try to communicate when I'm working with different teams, because they will argue with you that's not allowed. And how many times have you had that discussion with someone?
Yeah, no, a lot. And I think um the I want to say the happy path, but like the design path, without the proper controls, doesn't prevent or mitigate the threat from occurring. And really that was, one of the lenses that we look at from a threat modeling perspective is, what can go wrong. And then without those proper controls, although it may not be in the design, those certain attack vectors do exist for the attacker uh, to cause.
Yeah. So, yeah, we both experienced that. I think that's just one of the salient points I've seen of what the transition is, the recognizing, yeah, this is what it's supposed to do. But in reality, because of all these other things that we look at, we've discovered I can do something else other than this and get to the data. I can bypass the entire authentication mechanism or authorization. And they said, well, that's not supposed to happen. It's like, well, yeah, but that's because you're only looking at it from this perspective.
Right.
So I think, yes. So I know we could go on with a lot of examples there and more, but I appreciate that. Been a threat modeler and you've been doing threat modeling. How do you think your prior experience has helped you become a better threat modeler?
Yeah, I think, and I touched on it a bit, but I think just the experience as being a threat modeler has opened my eyes into like the broader sense of what it takes, what the perspective is to secure an application. So I saw like very small pieces, but as a threat modeler, it kind of opens you into the full design lifecycle. And I spoke a bit about, implementing threat modeling earlier in the process. So I've learned that the earlier you can implement threat modeling, the more valuable it'll be, not just to the threat modeler, but also to the developer, so they understand, at the earliest stage, how to implement those controls into their application or service.
So you had talked about your experience and prior to being a threat modeler, and some of that being SOC analyst, DLP engineer, things like that. And those focuses, you touched on something, I noted on it earlier, I wanted to come back to it, is signal. And I think for me, that's a real valuable thing that your background improved threat modeling for you and your team, is because you understood if I write a control that's noisy, let's say a detective control, this action's bad if you see it, alert.
Mhm.
Instead of it being just anytime this action is performed, alert, because that's noisy. So you get a low signal to noise ratio. Talk about that a little bit, because I think your experience is that made you better at writing controls in those areas.
Yeah, and I think of this as two ways, right? The first is being specific. So when we want to say we want to detect this action happening, we want to be very specific on, what specifically is it about this action that presents a threat to the system that we're securing. Um, so we want to be as granular as possible, such that we're not creating noise and response. Um,
So that makes a lot of sense, because like your SOC team is going to get very mad at you if they have to respond 1,000 times a day to a control that honestly it shouldn't be there if it's that noisy. because what is it really doing if it's just alerting all the time? You get alert fatigue and people just turn them off. So it's an ineffective control. And we've run into that before and we improved. I remember one of the early things I did at one of these companies, you might remember, unauthorized access. I banned the word unauthorized because at the SOC, when a log comes across, you can't divine intent. So if someone compromised an account or just someone already had access and was a bad actor, they're authorized. So writing things about unauthorized behavior is kind of silly because you, as a log comes across and gets alerted on, you can't divine intent or if it was actually the person that you thought it would be behind the keyboard. So the signal to noise is really narrowing down on the bad behavior. It's not just the API call, it's maybe a series of API calls, or maybe it's in the way or from where they enacted this call. That is the specificity that is needed to give high signal to noise ratio.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's kind of multiple ways to define like those accurate detection controls. I touched on like the specificity of like what those parameters are, not just the action. But then to your point, also, where is that identity performing the call from? Is it this identity that we've defined as an allowed identity to perform that action? So, the interpretation of authorized versus unauthorized is key. But defining, who are the allowed identities specifically, such that either if the SOC does receive an alert, they know that this is a defined identity that's allowed, or um, even more effective would be to incorporate that into the alert such that it doesn't even fire if a specific identity that we have proper controls around there, that's MFA or processes that really define a specific identity such that they're very limited in what they can perform in a break glass scenario, for instance.
No, no, I'm glad we got into this because I think this was a really good differentiator to describe the transition between the two different roles. So, Bryce, we've come to the end here. So, want to give you an opportunity to make any predictions about threat modeling or the industry going forward to close out, and then I'll finish out with a couple necessary security things.
Yeah, no, I think just from a threat modeling perspective, I think it's a really interesting and rewarding time to be in this industry because I think it's uh, while overdue. I think it's slowly starting to get some of the recognition that it deserves, and I think peers and leaders within organizations are starting to recognize the value of threat modeling as not just a practice, but also as a program, and the value of defining a threat modeling program and putting the resources into it. I think it's very exciting, and I'm glad to start seeing this kind of momentum behind the program itself.
Oh, so great. And I really appreciate you joining the first ever call and hope to have you back on more talks as we progress. So thank you very much for joining me. So this has been the first podcast discussion with Necessary Security's YouTube channel. And I'd like to invite everybody to subscribe or just check in from time to time and see the new content that we're producing. And again, this is meant to be an industry discussion conversation, not pushing tools or any things like that. It's entirely to focus on moving forward the thoughts and discussions of threat modeling. But I am running a business, and I, of course, would like to work with you and your companies on whatever needs you have for threat modeling or cloud security. So please do check out the website. I'll have links below. And that's all. So Bryce, thank you again, and see everybody later. Have a good day.